Hey guys, so we're going to start Unit 3, Environmental Chemistry. So the first part that we're going to talk about are chemicals that are found in our environment. And the first set of chemicals that we're going to look at are inorganic substances. And so inorganic substances, we need inorganic substances, you and I, as well as especially plants, in order to grow. And so they're essential for our development. Um, the difference between inorganic substances and organic substances, which we'll talk about later, are that organic substances like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, which are also known as lipids, we're always going to find a carbon and a hydrogen, those two elements in organic substances. So they're mostly made up of carbon and hydrogen bonds. Now, inorganic substances are going to be different elements that we find on our periodic table that we still need in order to grow and develop for certain parts of our body. Plants might need them in order to develop certain tissues for different roles in their life. So some of the ones that we're going to talk about, the first one is nitrogen. So nitrogen was a gas. It was a non-metal on our periodic table. And so it's essential for the growth of leaves and the stems of plants. And you and I also need nitrogen in order to grow and repair our cells and our body tissues. Another one is phosphorus. And so phosphorus is a large component of the roots and flowers of plants. And it also is needed for us in order for our bones and our teeth. And it's also a component of our DNA. So I don't know if you guys remember when we made our DNA molecules, but there was that phosphorus backbone, sugar phosphate backbone. So phosphorus is very important for the structure of our DNA, which has all the information that we need in order to be who we are. Phosphorus is also essential for photosynthesis in plants, which is a process where they make their own food using light energy. And that's something that you'll talk a little bit more about in grade 10 science. And you'll talk lots about it in Bio 20 if that's something that you choose to take. Potassium. Potassium is found in bananas, and it's really important for our muscle contraction and for nerve impulses, especially in our bodies. So if your parents are ever encouraging you to eat bananas, it's because they're high in potassium, and that is an inorganic substance that we definitely need in order to have a healthy body function. So if your muscles are ever cramping or really stiff and sore, it's always good to have a banana because there's lots of potassium. It's important that we regulate the amount of potassium in our body. You can overdo it, and you can actually get sick from having too much potassium in your body as well. So finding that nice balance is really important. It's also important for plants in their growth, especially in their early development. So then moving on, if we look at magnesium, magnesium is essential for photosynthesis in plants. And it's also, again, another component for our bones and our teeth. And another one that's not on the list is something like calcium. You guys have always heard, to drink milk because it's high in calcium. Calcium is a metal, and it actually is a large component of our bones and cartilage and teeth. So it is important. Then sulfur. So sulfur is essential for the production of all these guys, these grains, different types of protein. So sulfur helps make proteins that are really important and help with enzyme activation. So enzymes are used in order to help facilitate processes in our body, like they do stuff. They help with reactions. And so ensuring that we have the right enzymes and that everything is functioning the way it should is very important. Sulfur can also be a detoxifier, so it can help eliminate waste in our body as well as in plants. Okay. So another term for an inorganic substance are minerals. So these are solid inorganic substances. And so it's important that we do have certain minerals in our diet. Most often for minerals, we don't find them in the food that we eat. And so this is when you guys might see taking vitamins, and certain vitamins are going to be high in minerals. A term that you would have had to know for your PAT, which isn't something that I would really stress too much about, is a micromineral. So micro, okay, microscopic is referencing something that is small. Macro would be something that's large. So microminerals are small amounts of different types of minerals that we would need in order to maintain good body health. And so typically that would be 100 milligrams a day, and that's typically what you might find in certain vitamins that you take daily. So now looking at those inorganic substances, what lots of agriculturalists and farmers will do is when they're trying to grow certain plants, they realize that certain plants need certain amounts of inorganic substances. They need these substances to grow and develop just like you and I do in our diets. So when the soil where we're growing and planting these different crops, when the soil lacks these nutrients, when it lacks these inorganic substances, what we can do is add fertilizers. And so fertilizers can be natural or they can be chemically created and synthesized. And there are substances that we're adding to the soil and we're just adding inorganic substances and nutrients. And if you go to a gardening store, or if you go to even probably Canadian Tire or Home Depot where you can buy fertilizers, most often the primary nutrients that are going to be in a bag of fertilizer, which is something you would have had to know for your PAT, it's been a question on there, is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so these are the three primary or most often used inorganic nutrients that we add to soil to ensure healthy plant development. And so often you would see there would be quantities on your bag. So how much nitrogen is going to be in this fertilizer, how much phosphorus, and then how much potassium. And the quantities, the amount that you might want to add to your soil, depending on what kind of plant you're growing, will vary. And so you would just read the bag and see what kind of plant you're growing. And what I mean by that is certain plants require different nutrients or like different nutrients a little bit more. And so this is a term that you guys might have remembered from grade 7 is called crop rotation. And so it's not something we talk about in grade 9, but if you remember it, crop rotation is something that farmers will do. And so it's in order to help maintain the nutrients in the soil. So one year if they're growing potatoes, let's say potatoes love phosphorus and they just soak it up, phosphorus. And that's really what they primarily use in order to grow and develop it. And they're not really too keen on using nitrogen. So potatoes love phosphorus and are okay not using nitrogen. So by the end of the year, when I've grown my potatoes, all the phosphorus in the soil arguably would be gone because the potatoes had used it in order to grow and develop. And so the next year, if I were to grow potatoes again, well, there would be no phosphorus in the soil. And so the potatoes won't grow. So crop rotation, what it means is I rotate the crop. And so I decide to plant something different, grow something different that doesn't utilize phosphorus so much. And so let's say maybe I then grow corn in that same patch of field where there's no more phosphorus, but there's lots of nitrogen. And hypothetically, I don't know if this is true, but let's say corn loves nitrogen and it uses mostly nitrogen to grow and develop. So then I haven't had to change much about the soil composition, and I've just rotated and changed the kind of crop that I'm growing in order to ensure that it gets what it needs. And so that's something that farmers would do. But if they are pretty set on growing the same type of crop, or if the patch of land they have is notoriously known for not having the right nutrients, they can add fertilizers. Okay? And so fertilizers, they can vary. It's not just nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but these are the most common inorganic substances that are added. And so depending on what you're growing and what it likes, that's what you would add. Getting into human impact. So fertilizers, okay, they can have detrimental, so negative effects on ecosystems. And I'll get into why, but it's because of runoff, and these nutrients can end up in different ecosystems. So they can end up in aquatic ecosystems, in ponds and rivers and lakes. And if there's too much of a nutrient, just like I explained how you and I, if we eat too many bananas and have too much potassium, we can get sick. So can plants. If there's too much of a nutrient, there's too much potassium or too much nitrogen, they also will get sick and they won't be able to grow. Or there might be another plant or organism like algae that would actually take up these nutrients, and then they would start to grow so much, so fast, so rapidly that they would overtake all the other organisms in the area. And so having fertilizers or using them, we do have to be really careful about where these nutrients are leaching, where they're going, where they end up. And so it is a precaution and something that we have to be very cognizant of, aware of when we're using fertilizers, because they can have negative effects on the ecosystem. But so continuing with human impact, some other things, we can add fertilizers, which are chemicals, to our crop in order to help it grow. But we can also add what we call pesticides. And so when we're growing crops, we're often concerned with making sure that they grow and develop. And there are lots of different organisms. So there can be other plants that might be affecting their growth, or there can be insects that are eating them, or there's molds and funguses that are also overtaking the area, taking nutrients from them or breaking them down, eating them. There could be small rodents, so small mammals that are also eating these crops. So what we can use are called pesticides. So we're getting rid of pests. And there are some specific terms that are good to know. So pesticides control pests is a general term that we use, but some more specific terms could be herbicides. So herbs, looking at other plants, weeds, for example. And so weeds grow very quickly, very fast, and they can take up all the nutrients that maybe your corn or potatoes are needing. And so because they grow so quickly and they reproduce and pollinate so quickly, it's important that we get rid of them, and we don't want them to overtake our crops. So we can use herbicides. So these are chemicals that are designed to only kill the negative thing, kill the thing that you don't want. So they're not supposed to kill your potatoes or your corn or whatever you're growing, but they'll kill weeds. Then insecticides are often used. And so insecticides kill insects. They're going to kill the organisms, the insects that are eating your plants. And so this is also why it's always important to wash your fruits and vegetables when you get them, because you never know if a farmer is using certain types of pesticides. We don't know a lot of the negative effects yet on humans, having used a lot of these different pesticides. But so insecticides are designed to just kill insects and not harm the plants that we want to grow. Fungicides kill funguses, molds that are also affecting our plants' growth. Okay. So the use of pesticides, I don't know if you remember in grade 7, you guys would have talked about DDT, which was a pesticide used. And there are some videos that I would like you guys to watch. But it was a common pesticide used in order to kill a lot of mosquitoes. And people sprayed it absolutely everywhere, in their homes, in their bed, throughout their clothes. And so it was kind of like this revolutionary chemical that killed something that bothered us, mosquitoes. But we didn't know the negative effects that this chemical would have on the ecosystem. And so by using a lot of DDT, what it actually had done is it affected the reproduction of a lot of different organisms. And so it started to affect ecosystems. So there are some videos I would like you guys to watch that kind of go into some more detail about DDT. But so it was a common pesticide. So we wanted to get rid of mosquitoes and certain insects, and it did the job. It definitely killed them, but it did have some negative consequences on our health as well as other organisms in the ecosystem. So we don't use it today anymore, and there are alternatives. Okay. So yeah, so DDT was a synthetic organic compound used as an insecticide. So it was designed to kill mosquitoes. But this is another term that you don't have to know for your PAT anymore. It used to be on your grade 9 PAT, but it's called biomagnification. And so I'll also have another video for you guys to watch about biomagnification. It's something you learned in grade 7, but bio means life, and magnification, to magnify something, means to make it bigger. So through the use of pesticides, there's a process called biomagnification. And so what happens is the concentration, the amount of chemical, starts to increase as you go up the food chain, and it becomes more dangerous. So when you spray this chemical and there are small insects that are affected, there is a small percentage of that chemical among the insects. But when you have, let's say, a rabbit come along, or something that would eat insects, say a rabbit for sure. So a rabbit comes along and eats all those insects, or it eats the grass that is now doused in this chemical. The concentration, the amount of chemical, is then going to stay inside the rabbit's body. And so there's a certain percentage, a certain amount of chemical in the rabbit. Then when we have a fox or a coyote come along and eat a rabbit, when the fox eats the rabbit, that amount of chemical is now going to be in the fox. And if the fox finds 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 rabbits to eat that also have that chemical inside them, then there's going to be a lot of chemical in the fox, because it's not just eating 1 rabbit, but it's eating 5. So the amount of chemical starts to increase as we look at larger organisms, as we go up the food chain. And so now this fox is roaming around, and it has a lot of chemical, a lot of pesticide or DDT inside its body. It doesn't go anywhere. It's not able to break it down. And so then later on, when that fox or coyote gets eaten by a bear, that bear isn't just going to eat 1 coyote with a certain amount of chemical in it, but it's going to eat a few. And so eventually when we get up to the bear, it's going to have so much chemical inside its body, the amount has magnified as we've gone up the food chain, that it's going to really affect the bear's quality of life. And it might prevent it from reproducing or just being healthy. And so it can cause a lot of problems in an ecosystem. So this magnification, this increase of chemical as we go up the food chain, becomes really dangerous, especially if we look at aquatic ecosystems. If we're looking at in the ocean and the things that we eat, small phytoplankton, you've seen plankton on SpongeBob. So these guys are affected by chemicals and pesticides that leach into the ocean, into aquatic ecosystems. And then when larger fish start to eat these plankton, then that chemical is now inside those fish. And then when we look at things like shark, which are actually really common food sources, especially in Aboriginal communities, it's dangerous to eat those larger aquatic organisms. And so eating things even like salmon can be dangerous because they are large fish and they do eat other organisms. And there can be a lot of chemicals inside them. And so you'll notice that the larger the organism, the more dangerous and the higher the chance that there are large chemicals inside their body. And then that can affect us as well. So we do have to be really cognizant. So biomagnification is when chemicals start to increase in their amount. They accumulate in the food chain. They don't go anywhere. Another concept is pesticide resistance. So we talked about adaptations in the first unit. And so we talked about how if I were to originally spray an area, so if I look at this top left-hand corner leaf, If I'm spraying a pesticide and it affects the white colored, where are they? Insects. What can happen is there are certain insects that might not be affected by that chemical. And so what's going to happen over time is the resistant insect, the one that wasn't affected, is going to survive. So strong survive. And if it survives, then it's going to reproduce. And when it reproduces, it will likely create resistant offspring, babies. And so then the chemical that I'm using on these insects, eventually over time, it could become resistant. And the population, the type of insect, has evolved and changed and adapted, and it is no longer affected. So I'm going to have to come up with a different type of chemical to use, which can be very challenging. This is also something when we look at antibiotics, when we look at medicines, when we're looking at bacteria in our body, like strep throat, streptococcus, it's a bacteria. And you'll take penicillin. So it's an antibiotic. Think of it like a chemical or a pesticide. And when you take this antibiotic, when you take penicillin, it's designed to kill the bacteria. But if you are regularly taking this antibiotic and if you're not finishing it and not killing all the bacteria, so this is why your doctors will always insist that you finish your prescription, that you finish taking all the pills, even if you feel better. And that's because there could be bacteria that becomes resistant. So it's not affected by the penicillin, it doesn't kill it, and so it lingers, it stays. And then what happens later on, if you have that bacteria, then penicillin won't work, and you'll have to come up with an alternative. And doctors might not have an alternative to kill that bacteria. So then you can get really sick. So understanding pesticide resistance is really important, and the chemicals that we use, antibiotics that we take, and bacteria. And so, yeah, so it's an important concept that you'll also talk a little bit more about in grade 10 science, as well as Bio 20. The last section is looking at waste. And so some side effects to the things that we've been talking about, like fertilizers, for example, is if I have this field here, if you're looking at the picture, you can see that when it rains, these chemicals are going to go and move to different aquatic ecosystems. So it's called runoff. So when water starts moving, so it's going to go down, it's going to take a path of least resistance. And so all these chemicals then are going to end up in these drains or these ducts or these ditches, and it's going to continue moving to the lowest point. And so eventually the lowest point could be a lake or a river, or the ocean. And so all these chemicals are then going to end up in those areas where they're not supposed to be, and they can cause lots of damage. A term that's really important to know is sewage, and you might have heard of it before. So these are undissolved, so solid materials that we often dispose of. They come from our kitchens and our bathrooms, our toilets, our drains. And so sewage, this waste, moves through pipes. And it ends up in what we call septic tanks. And so septic tanks are these large tanks that collect all this sewage, all this waste, and there's bacteria, decomposers that help break down all the stuff. And so sewage treatment plants are really important. I live in Edmonton, and so we have our North Saskatchewan River. And so throughout the river, there are water treatment plants where they take the water and they treat it. And they try and clean it from different materials, ensure that the nutrients that are in the water are level and that there's not too much, that there's enough oxygen in the water. So all the waste that we dispose of every time we're flushing the toilet or turning on the tap, a majority of that is ending up in septic tanks or in some type of sewage treatment plant where we clean and filter and take care of the water. Okay? And so affluent water is a term that we use for treated water, so it's clean. Okay? A lot of our solid waste, okay, we did talk about this again also in Unit A when we looked at landfills and just incinerators. So it's a little bit of a review because now we are looking at still chemicals and the materials that we use and the importance of taking care of them and disposing of them properly. So a lot of the garbage collects in our households. Hopefully we recycle a lot of it. So we try and reuse those materials. We try and especially the things like glass, we try and reuse those things. Pop cans, we recycle them and then break them down and make them into new pop cans. And so there are still lots of landfills, though, where we dispose of our waste. And so those are detrimental for our planet Earth and for the environment. So we do have to be really cognizant about what we're disposing of and what we could be recycling based on the chemical composition of those things. So next week, we'll talk about acids and bases. I do have a couple of videos that I would like you guys to watch this week. There's some reading in your textbook and check and reflect. So please email me if you guys have any questions or concerns. Otherwise, have a great week.